When you think about schooling in Australia, what do you think about? What do you imagine? Something like that? The images of schooling and the way that they kind of capture our thoughts are actually incredibly powerful, as Bunkeroy has already shown us. Is it something like that? Far more schools, far more kids in Australia are in schools that look like that, many of them in suburbs. Or perhaps is it something like that? Of course, Australian schooling already captures a world of difference, and all of that is in the normal routine, the things that already happen before we start talking about how we're going to make education creative and do all kinds of new things and innovate our way into the future. And one of the great challenges, but also one of the great opportunities, is that world of difference. It comes from the recognition that every one of those images at some point in Australia's history was quite a radical institutional innovation. And the way in which we got to a point where millions of kids are being educated to a pretty reasonable standard, at least most of them, was by taking educational practices and building them into institutions. But as we've already heard brilliantly illustrated this morning, when institutions become normalised, when they operate everywhere, when they become invisible and part of the background routine, when we become to rely on them so that we can go off and do the other things in our lives, they take on a life of their own. And the purposes and the possibilities of learning somehow become detached and separated from the dominant feelings and the routines that institutions create. But the current reality of Australian schooling already contains those multiple realities. So what's the recent story of Australian schooling? Well, it's been a normal expectation in Australia, just as people often think. Australia has one of the highest standards of life or quality of life in the world. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's got some of the best weather and the best beaches. It's got one of the highest kind of visual recognitions and brand identities of any country around the world in the rest of the globe. And people have thought that in general, Australian education, schooling is pretty good. Maybe some issues around the edges, but generally pretty good. But more recently, the evidence, the best available international evidence, has been showing that the story is, if there's a race to the future going on, then Australia is falling behind. And this image, this idea that actually other countries, other cultures, and other approaches to schooling might be getting to the future faster is been kind of creeping into the Australian consciousness and doing more and more to motivate and focus our discussions about what should be happening in education policy and what should be happening in schools. I don't know how easy it is to pick up that graphic, but it basically shows the OECD PISA results across the decade to 2009. Of course, there's a new set of PISA results coming out in a couple of weeks. There's going to be massive excitement, and we'll have to see where Australia ends up. And it's interesting in itself, of course, how powerful international statistics have become in kind of setting our imaginations and prompting our conversations about what should be happening. But nonetheless, they are incredibly influential. And what you can see there is a picture of Australia no longer comfortably among the top rank of education nations. Perhaps even more interestingly, on the 2009 PISA results, 4 of the top 5 schooling systems in the world are in our region: Shanghai, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. And Australia is not the 5th, of course. Finland was the 5th. And so it's a big question as our region engages in a huge, deep transformation which is changing the world, and cultures, innovations, ways of thinking, populations and economies in different parts of the Asia-Pacific region kind of burst into global influence. How do we adapt and adjust? Should we feel the pressure? What can we learn? Over the last 5 years, the federal policy reform process that I've been most involved in, and many others have been too, the answer to that has been to try and set new goals for schooling through a kind of, partly through a storytelling process about the Asian century. And about a year ago, just over a year ago, the previous Australian government published this very long, very thick white paper called Australia in the Asian Century, with a whole lot of very impressive statistics in it. But fundamentally, it said, this transformation is changing the world, and it will change Australia. It's basically a good thing, despite the fact that it contains both all the challenges that Richard opened up with and many of the potential opportunities. And it will demand that we reconfigure the way we learn, not just in school, but across many different domains. We tried to set a series of ambitious goals. One of them was Australia becoming one of the top innovation nations in a broader sense. Another was being one of the top schooling and education nations. And many other things besides, including developing a quite different cultural understanding and level of relationship with the many different faces and parts of the Asia-Pacific region. So that's all fine, that's all good, although it's actually not fully accepted, and I'll come on to some aspects of that in a second. But how do you do it? What should we be doing, given that we have this heavily institutionalized schooling system, which is already part of our landscape, full of professionals, most of them well-meaning, but we still have the inequity, we still have the drift, and we have some worries. If you talk to anyone who works for any government in Australia, we have some worries about our future budget spending. Here's one kind of fundamental bit. I apologise to Tanya that that's a slide full of boxes. But education reform over the last 5 or 6 years has involved trying to work through collaboratively most aspects of the formal schooling system, assessment, curriculum, professional standards, and so on, and to try and find ways of linking the best evidence about how things could work and what is effective for student outcomes with the framework within which teachers and schools and students are working. The most difficult bit of that has been the reworking of our funding system. And through a very kind of carefully, painstakingly calibrated process, which did take most of 5 years in itself, assembling the transparency, putting together the experts, working out the basis for dialogue and negotiation with state governments, bringing in the non-government school sector, trying to involve the community in a debate and so on. Australia got to a point of agreeing on the reconfiguration of that funding framework. And as Richard said, the basic Gonski framework, named after the eminent businessman, non-political businessman who chaired the panel, was equity with choice, or choice with equity. You recognise that the type of school that parents send their children to should not be the determinant either of one kind of funding or of one kind of life chance for students. And then you look to use public funding from its combined sources of two different levels of government to try and make sure that the disadvantages or the challenges that a student brings to the education process are reflected in the way that they're funded. It's complex in its implementation and its operation, but it's pretty simple at its core. And my reason for bringing it up, I guess, is that, before I go on to the kind of closing part of my presentation, we've worked through every other aspect of the schooling system and framework and got a reasonable and a respectable degree of consensus backed by experts and evidence in all those other dimensions. But this week, the new Federal Education Minister, Christopher Pyne, has declared that he doesn't like this. And it doesn't matter that he said before the election that he was going to live with it. Actually, he doesn't like it. He thinks that not so many people are signed up to it, and he's going to renegotiate it to make it work better and differently. Now, I think it's an interesting reflection point, because the way that I see it, I can't see any other institution or interest group that actually has an interest in joining him. Non-government schools, media organisations, employers, parents, professionals. There's an interesting reflection there about how complex change occurs. The deep changes, perhaps the radical innovations, really become embedded when they are absorbed into society and when they're accepted and understood by a wider spread of members of the community and institutions. They're not the preserve of governments. But I say it, I guess, because I think it's important that if this basic framework of fairness is going to survive, it won't be a matter of politics. It'll be a matter of who in the community decides it's worth having and whether they're prepared to say so. But to kind of go on to whether or not that makes any difference, once you've sorted out the basic institutional building blocks and linked them back to public governance and accountability, you also have to work out a more fundamental tension. And that's the tension between this and this. This is much more, rather than my kind of policy slides, a characterization of what's going on between in education at the moment and where the race to the future will be determined. We all rely, particularly in education and bureaucracies, but actually in every kind of organisation, more or less, although I'd be interested in Sanjit's reflection on that, maybe in the discussion, we all rely on those tri-level, functional, vertically separated structures to make order out of the chaos of the weekly and the annual routine, don't we? But this is a graphical representation of the network structure of the internet. It's self-generating, it's constantly multiplying, and for me, it kind of visualizes and illustrates the path that a learner can take if they can make their own connections and follow the kind of self-directed potential which a digital aid makes possible. And I'm guessing we would all agree that the waste of potential implicit in our institutionalized education systems, and so well illustrated in the previous presentation, is something that we know we have to act on. Now, I'm almost out of time, but I guess what I want to say in closing to try and prompt your further thinking and perhaps some further discussion is if we want to grab that future, win the so-called race to the future, we definitely won't do it by spending another 10 years having politicised arguments about moving around the boxes within that slide. The cycles of education policy and politics are brilliantly geared towards doing that. In many ways, we're all experts at how to reproduce those fights and then not get very far with the more radical innovations. But at the same time, if you want a more creative future, you have to engage with the tension between this and this. You can't just generate beautiful innovations that are totally separated from the way that our mainstream structures of everyday life operate. As Bunker Roy said, you have to build the relationships outwards and find ways of seeing whether the best of innovative practice can actually be reflected in that kind of perverse and institutionalized reality. And for me, the best opportunity to do that, the best way to do that, is to go to the learner. Personalisation, realising the potential and the possibility, the excitement of personalisation by integrating every aspect of an education system around each learner and refusing to accept less than brilliant results for any learner is the only way to bring about more radical, large-scale system change. In 1998, when I published my first written work, Learning Beyond the Classroom, I concluded that the two tests that we ought to focus on for an education system are these. How well can students apply what they've learned in settings beyond their schools, and how well prepared and motivated are they to continue learning throughout their adult lives? I still can't do better than that. Thanks very much.